Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, today I wanted to talk a little bit with you about my thoughts on mandates for mask wearing in public indoor spaces and for vaccinations in various contexts. Uh, they're being discussed uh, in some places, some cities around the country and around the world, or some countries, they're being implemented. So I want to know what you think, and I'm going to tell you what I think. I'd love to hear from you about this issue. So, to start with, I really think that it's important to kind of get a grasp of the scale of the problem we're facing with the COVID pandemic, the worst pandemic by far that we've had to deal with since more than 100 years ago. And, as you probably know, so far in the United States, about 640,000 people have died from COVID, although that's thought by many experts who study the demographics of this sort of thing to be an underestimate. And there are 4.5 million confirmed deaths all around the world, again, thought to be an underestimate from COVID. Here in the United States, in addition to the 640,000 who have been confirmed to have passed away from COVID, uh, over 2.5 million people have been hospitalized over the year and a half of the pandemic. Anywhere from an estimated 10 to 30% of people who are infected with COVID, as I've talked about before, regardless of whether it's a serious case or not, and almost regardless of age, about 10 to 30% of people who are infected with COVID develop long COVID, meaning they have severe long-term health effects such as lung impairment, heart damage, cognitive difficulties, lack of energy, and so on and so forth over the long term, many months or even now over a year for some people who got infected with COVID early on in the pandemic. So 10 to 30% in general, and at the moment the estimate seems to be about 5% of kids under about 12 or so. So we're talking about many millions of people just here in the United States. And, over the summer, as the Delta variant of COVID, which is more than twice as contagious as the original COVID virus, has become prevalent, the number of daily new confirmed cases, has increased by more than 10 times since the beginning of the summer. The number of people hospitalized at any given time for COVID has increased by a factor of 7. And the number of deaths daily from COVID since the beginning of the summer has more than tripled. And that's in spite of the fact that over the summer, of course, the level of vaccination has increased from roughly a third of people back in maybe late May or so to a little over 50% now. And that's because the Delta variant is just that much more contagious. There still are a lot of people who are unvaccinated, particularly kids under 12, none of whom can be vaccinated yet. They haven't authorized vaccines yet for that age group, although they've been in clinical trials for a while. And there are breakthrough cases in vaccinated people, particularly as the Delta variant has emerged, and particularly as it turns out in older people. Although the vaccines do cut down on the rate of infection and various other outcome variables such as hospitalizations and deaths by quite a lot, as I'll talk about in more detail later. But Nothing's 100%. And so we face an enormous crisis. Just think about what a colossal tragedy this is. Over 640 times as many people have died of COVID over the past year and a half than are killed by police officers in a typical year. And yet, we had massive protests involving millions of people against police violence last summer. As well we should. It's a terrible injustice, right? But, we should be more upset than that over what's been happening to us over the past year and a half with COVID. And, honestly, it doesn't seem like that's the case for a lot of people. Some more aspects of perspective. 640,000 people is about the same number of people as die of heart disease or cancer in a given year, although COVID's over a year and a half, but that places it squarely at number 3 on the list of causes of death and several times more deadly than any other cause of death. So if you are deeply disturbed by this and highly motivated to figure out ways that we can end this pandemic as soon as we possibly can, what can I say? You have no heart. You have no compassion. You have no empathy. Let alone concern that something terrible could happen to you, that you could get very sick or possibly even die. And I know that death is not a very likely outcome if you're young, but it can happen. And long COVID is a likely outcome, and an increasing number of young people are getting seriously ill. So, but hopefully you think about others as well, because millions of people have lost family members to COVID. Millions of people have been disabled by COVID, and on and on and on. Obviously a lot of people have lost jobs or lost insurance because of COVID. Many other outcomes attributable to it, or although in the latter cases, of course, is not just COVID, it's the fact that we live in, as Trump put it about other countries, a shithole country that doesn't have universal health care and hasn't taken care of people very well economically during the pandemic. Okay, well, let's get to the topic of mandates. Hopefully, mask mandates aren't as controversial as vaccine mandates. Because nobody was ever harmed by wearing a mask when you go out in public in an indoor space around strangers. And research overwhelmingly shows that mask mandates are helpful in the battle against COVID. I'll present some studies on that later. But some people, it's just outrageous that we're mandating that people wear masks. So you consider what Saagar and Enjeti of Breaking Points and formerly Rising YouTube podcasts. What did he say? He said back when D.C., Washington D.C., where he lives, had decided to impose a mask mandate for everyone, not just unvaccinated people, which, as I've talked about before, was a colossally stupid idea on the part of the CDC for a couple of reasons. One is they knew there were breakthrough cases where potentially an infected, vaccinated person could, even though it might be less likely, possibly transmit the virus to other people. They didn't know that there would be, really they should have known what was coming. Delta variant was already around in the UK and had already devastated India. So they knew that was coming, and yet they got rid of the mask mandate for vaccinated people anyway. Stupid idea because there are breakthrough cases, and also because, let's face it, the people who haven't gotten the vaccine up to this point, or up to that point back in May, are mostly the same people who don't want to wear a mask either. Now, granted, um, a lot of people who haven't been vaccinated either can't because they're kids or they're immunocompromised or what have you, um, or they're just skittish about it for whatever reason, but aren't dead set against it. So yeah, let me you change what I said there a bit. There's a big overlap between people who are against the vaccine and people who are against wearing masks. And as it turns out, a lot of people who are unvaccinated admitted in public opinion polls that once the CDC dropped the requirement or the suggestion, it was never really a national requirement, unlike in most other countries, but dropped the recommendation that vaccinated people wear masks. Unvaccinated people admitted on surveys that they stopped wearing masks too. Hardly anybody was wearing masks for the first part of the summer, and then along came Delta, and kaboom, we have a resurgence of the virus. So Saagar says here, DC has literally had 2 corona deaths in the last 2 weeks. Expect nothing less than the hall monitor capital of the world. So there are a number of things wrong with that. First of all, as I already said, DC did have a mandate for unvaccinated people, but as I said, a lot of unvaccinated people simply ignored that, and also, Saagar is ignoring the fact that vaccinated people, although they're protected from COVID, are not perfectly protected, so they can get it and they can transmit it. And also just not understanding how the rate of cases of a highly contagious virus can rapidly grow. So, DC might have had 2 coronavirus deaths in the past 2 weeks at that point, but had they done nothing, why would you not expect that they would have more now? Because let's look at cases in DC. So he made these, not very well thought out comments in late July, at which point daily average of new cases in Washington, D.C. was about 60. Let's see if 57 on July 29th when he made his comment. Now it's 163. So it's gone up quite a bit. Would have gone up more given what we know about the fact that universal mask wearing does reduce cases of new infections of COVID. It would undoubtedly be a lot more than that if DC hadn't done something. We can talk about evidence on that in a little while. As for deaths, there's still not many deaths, but 4 deaths just Friday or Thursday, as opposed to 2 in the whole second half of July, which Saagar was commenting on. So, I don't know about you guys, but one person dying unnecessarily from a preventable disease is one person too many, to me. I don't know about Saagar. I guess he doesn't, feel that way. And, that's bullshit. And he goes on to say, In the vaccine age, rising cases don't matter, only deaths and hospitalizations do. Breakthrough cases are irrelevant if they aren't a threat to you or the elderly. New CDC mask guidance is ironically undermining faith in the vaccine. Um, okay, well that was the narrative. We're at the end of July at the point where he's making these comments. This is well into the rise of the Delta variant, which, as we've talked about before, is more than twice as infectious as the original COVID variant, not that much less infectious than chickenpox. And we knew all along that there were going to occasionally be breakthrough cases, and that occasionally those breakthrough cases would result in hospitalizations and death, mainly in the elderly. So, faith in the vaccine should not be taken to the level that Saagar is here of thinking that it makes you invincible. It doesn't. No vaccine ever invented in the history of humanity has made you bulletproof. It just doesn't happen. So he's really full of crap here. Asking vaxxed Americans to mask up when COVID is not a threat to them is asking them to have more regard for the health of the unvaxxed than they have for themselves. Well, first of all, how is it a threat to anybody's health to wear a fucking mask? Come on, that's absurd. And second, again, COVID is a threat to vaccinated people. It's not as much of a threat as it is to unvaccinated people, but it's a threat both to make them sick, which I don't know about you, but I don't want to be sick with COVID, even if it's a mild case, especially since it could turn into long COVID, and not unlikely for that to happen. So it is partly about having regard for your own health, and as we'll discuss in more detail in a moment, the older you are, the more your own health, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, becomes a concern. The older you are, So, and then of course, if you have COVID, granted, if you have a less severe case, you're going to have a lower viral load, and it's going to be, you're going to be less contagious, but, you still could transmit it, especially if you have a worse case. So, again, just totally uninformed, ideologically based ranting from Saagar here. And, I've noticed that, his co-host, Crystal Ball, he really doesn't push back at all on his bad takes on COVID, which are very frequent. Okay, well, let me go ahead and show you the data that we have on vaccinated cases of COVID, breakthrough cases of COVID, as a function of age. Let's see, where the heck did it go? Here we go. Okay, so this is a study of rates of severe illness among vaccinated versus unvaccinated people in Israel, where most of the population's vaccinated. They've kind of been stuck on a vaccination rate of about 62 or 3%, I think, for most of the summer. Unfortunately, they need to get on the stick there, but they do have a higher vaccination rate than the U.S. at 51%. But anyway, on to the data. So this was for people over the age of 16, those eligible for the vaccine in Israel, 16 and up, I guess. Um, 78.7% are fully vaxxed. 18.2% are not vaccinated. I guess they didn't break it down further by people who've only had one shot, but maybe there aren't that many of those. Okay, now let's look at severe cases. People who were not vaxxed had roughly 3 times the case rate of people who are fully vaxxed. But then when we break it down by age, people under 50 who were not vaccinated had a case rate of 3.9 per 100,000 getting a severe case of COVID that was likely to put them in the hospital. People who were vaccinated, on the other hand, had only a 0.3 per 100,000 chance of developing severe COVID. So let's see, that's 3.5 million fully vaxxed people, 11 severe cases. So quite impressive. A 13-fold difference there between the unvaxxed and fully vaccinated people. Now, for people over 50, the picture changes quite a bit. People over 50 have a rate of severe cases of COVID if they're not vaxxed, according to these data from Israel, of 91.9 people per 100,000. 171 people with severe cases, who are not vaxxed and over 50. Among the fully vaxxed people, there were 13.6 severe cases per 100,000. 290 cases overall. So actually more severe cases in the fully vaxxed group who are over 50 than the not vaxxed group. But remember, a lot more of the fully vaxxed people are vaccinated. Just over 90% of people over 50 in Israel are fully vaccinated. And so the vaccines provide a considerable amount of protection against severe illness, from 91.9 for unvaxxed people per 100,000 down to 13.6 per 100,000 in fully vaxxed people. So, I'm going to do some quick math there. More than 6 times as likely to get a severe case of COVID if you're over 50 and not vaxxed than if you're over 50 and fully vaxxed. But take a look at this. For fully vaxxed people over 50, 13.6 per 100,000 severe cases of COVID. For unvaxxed people under 50, 3.9 cases per 100,000 of severe COVID. So you're actually more likely to get infected with a severe case of COVID, which more often than not will put you in the hospital if you're over 50 and vaccinated, than if you're under 50 and not vaccinated. Now remember, that doesn't mean it's risk-free or virtually risk-free if you're young and unvaccinated, because you can get long COVID, and 43 cases out of a million is definitely not zero. Now let's look at it. Let's break it down further here by. Okay, I'm going to need my glasses for this because it's smaller print. Let's break it down further by different age groups. This is from the same study in Israel. For ages 12 to 15, which I guess some people in that age group are vaccinated, not very many. Okay, so it does go down to age 12, just like here in the United States. I was thinking it was 16, but it is down to 12. But there are a lot more young kids proportionally in Israel than there are here. Their population average age is younger than the United States. Anyway, so about 30% of 12 to 15-year-olds are not vaxxed, 62%, fully vaxxed, 62% unvaxxed. And, you know, very slim chance of getting a severe case of COVID, although you could still get long COVID if you are between 12 and 15, even if you're not vaccinated. But if you're fully vaccinated, severe cases of COVID. Same for the 16 to 19-year-olds, of whom most are vaccinated, 73.5%. Some severe cases of COVID for the unvaxxed, but none for fully vaxxed. Same with 20 to 29-year-olds. Similar rate of cases to 16 to 19-year-olds for unvaxxed. No cases for fully vaxxed. 30 to 39-year-olds, 6.2 out of 100,000 likelihood of getting a severe case of COVID. 0.2 for people who are fully vaxxed. 16.5 out of 100,000 severe cases for unvaxxed 40 to 49-year-olds. 1 out of 100,000 among fully vaxxed 40 to 49-year-olds. So a 16-fold reduction in severe cases of COVID. 40-year-olds, 50 people in their 50s, 40.2 for unvaxxed severe cases out of 100,000 to 2.9 severe cases out of 100,000 for fully vaxxed. For those in their 60s, 76.6 for unvaxxed, 8.7 for fully vaxxed. But notice how fully vaxxed 60 to 69-year-olds have the same approximate, or just, actually have a little bit more likelihood of a severe case than 30 to 39-year-olds. 70 to 79-year-olds, whoppingly higher severe case rate, 190 out of 100,000, than those in their 60s or 50s and so forth. But cuts it tenfold down to 19 out of 100,000 if they've been vaccinated. But bear in mind, 19 is a lot higher than the rates for unvaccinated young people. You have to go up to 40 to 49-year-olds to get a comparable figure for unvaxxed people being as likely, almost as likely to get severe COVID as fully vaccinated 70 to 79-year-olds. And same thing for the other age groups, right? Their rate of getting severe COVID, if they're not vaxxed, continues to go up. The risk is substantially reduced for them if they are fully vaxxed, but it's nowhere near as low as the risk of severe COVID for, anybody under 50, basically. And again, that's not taking into account long COVID. This is severe initial cases. But still, the point is that your immune system, on average, not necessarily for every individual, but on average, your immune system declines in its effectiveness as you get older. And so, vaccines help you a lot, but you're starting from a lower baseline in terms of level of immune system functioning. And so, an elderly person who's fully vaxxed is actually less protected against a severe case of COVID, again, not counting long COVID, than a younger person who is not fully vaxxed. So, if you're saying shit like Saagar Enjeti said here, that, if you're vaccinated, COVID is not a threat to you, that's bullshit, Particularly if you're older, COVID is still a threat to you, even if you're vaccinated. Not as much as a threat to you as if you're unvaccinated, but still a threat. Okay? So, assuming that masks are effective then, it would make sense to wear them, and asking people to mask up regardless of whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated makes perfect sense. And now, a poll suggests that more Americans agree with me than agree with Saagar and Enjeti 64% of Americans polled recently, up to 68% in high COVID areas, or increasing COVID areas, which really is everywhere now. But, a sizable majority support mask mandates. Republicans like Saagar oppose mask mandates by a margin of 56 to 40. Independents, that's pretty much reverse, 60 to 35. Democrats, 87 favor, 9 oppose. And, I don't know about specifically independents who are lefties. They don't poll specifically for that. So, broken down by ethnicity, black, Hispanic, and Asian people, overwhelmingly, especially Asian and black people surveyed, overwhelmingly favor mask mandates. It's among white people, not surprisingly. That's where you got all the Trumpers, the MAGA people. That's where you find the most opposition, 37%. But, the majority of localities in the United States, especially at the state level, currently do not have mask mandates. A few states and several big cities and counties have reinstated mandates in the wake of Delta variant, the much more contagious variety of COVID taking over. But it's only 5 states at this point: Hawaii, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, and Oregon. Now, you might be surprised to see Louisiana on the list because it's, a deep red state in the deep south. But, they hadn't had a mask mandate until recently, and then they started having their hospitals completely overwhelmed, which they still are. COVID is just totally out of control in Louisiana. I think it still has the highest rate of new cases per capita of any state in the country. But anyway, only 5 states, and then Washington State is going to be added to the list pretty soon. And there are locales, like individual cities, like in counties like Los Angeles, like San Francisco, my county, Monroe County here, where Bloomington, Indiana is, just recently re-implemented a mask mandate, and most people follow it. I'd say like 90% wear a mask, depending on where you go. But let's look at some efficacy data, and you see why it's so important that we get more people to wear masks. This was a study done last year in Kansas, where they didn't have a statewide mask mandate. They suggested that states have a mandate, but they didn't require it. And so this study looked at rates of COVID cases over the period from June 1st to August 23rd, comparing counties that did or didn't have a mask mandate. And, in a nutshell, counties that did have a mask mandate had a decrease in new cases per 100,000 people of 6%. In the midst of a surge, they had a decrease in cases. Counties without a mask mandate, the surge continued. They had an increase over that period from July 3rd to August 23rd of 100%. The rate of new cases per 100,000 people doubled. Here's a recent study looking at mask mandates in schools. I haven't looked over the article recently and haven't highlighted anything, so I'm not going to go into details, but, basically, what they've shown is that uh, you merely suggesting that students, teachers, etc., wear masks in school. It doesn't work very well. A lot of kids, uh, you know, parents don't send them to school with masks and so on. But mandating masks works very well for getting people to wear masks in schools, and it does, just like the other study showed, it does cut back on cases by a substantial amount. Okay, here we go. Data from our research and from studies conducted in Utah, Missouri, and Wisconsin shows that school transmission rates of coronavirus were low when schools enforced mask mandates. By contrast, one school in Israel without a mask mandate or proper social distancing protocols reported an outbreak of COVID-19 involving 153 students and 25 staff members. They don't say how many students were in that school, but there have been many other cases where big outbreaks of COVID have occurred in schools and summer camps and so forth, among unmasked and largely unvaccinated groups of kids and supervising adults. Another study looked at the impact of a mask mandate being implemented in Melbourne, Australia. Let's see. So they looked at it, compared before and after, and found, let's see, mask usage rose from approximately 43% to 97% after the mandate. And between, depending on how they did the estimate, 22 and 33% reduction in the growth rate of COVID. It actually stopped growing after the mask mandate was implemented, as opposed to before. And they took into account possible confounding variables there, so pretty clear findings. Okay, well, let's move on to talking about a topic that may be a bit more controversial, vaccine mandates. Now, of course, bear in mind, we've always had some sort of vaccine mandate. Well, not always, but always as far as you or I are concerned, because they've been around since well before any of us were born. They've had mass mandates, excuse me, not mass mandates, vaccine mandates for certain diseases in order to attend public school for well over 100 years, and similar length of time that there have been vaccine requirements for travel to and from certain other countries. But now we're talking about mandates in places other than schools. So places like Los Angeles and New York City, the entire country of France. Even hilariously enough, Fox News Corporation are implementing vaccine mandates of sorts. So basically, the ones in, I think maybe San Francisco is also doing it. The ones in cities around the country are targeting things like restaurants and bars and gyms, places where people congregate indoors in potentially crowded areas. And, of course, in a restaurant, you can't wear a mask, at least not when you're actually eating, nor in a bar can you wear a mask while you're drinking. You may not want to wear a mask while you're exercising. So, from a public health standpoint, it kind of makes sense the places that they chose, you know, uh, mass transit. Well, let me just talk about corporations that are mandating vaccines. Google, Amtrak, several different airlines, Microsoft, NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Those are, if you work at the office, you don't have to get vaccinated if you work from home. Twitter, hundreds of universities, Indiana University in the town where I live, and in various other places in Indiana, is mandating vaccines for all students, faculty, and staff starting this fall. So, right now, students are back. And there have also been mandates implemented in various cities in China. New Zealand recently mandated that folks who work at the border, like customs inspectors and so forth, who therefore potentially come into contact with foreign travelers, are now mandated to get a vaccine. I don't know if they've mandated vaccines for people traveling into the country or not. I guess not, since I think the person who started the recent outbreak there was from somewhere else and wasn't, and I know he wasn't vaccinated. No, that's not what I wanted. Cuba has mandates not just for school children, but for everyone in the entire country for not COVID yet. They haven't done that yet because their vaccines are still, they just started giving them. And so far, people aren't refusing them en masse. But anyway, there's like a dozen diseases where everybody has to be vaccinated as a child, and quite a few diseases have been eliminated. Also, the Pentagon just recently announced that they were implementing mandates for all military personnel. Let's see, where am I trying to go here? Okay. And also, the Biden administration just announced a national vaccine mandate for nursing home staff. Makes perfect sense from a public health perspective, right? Because as I showed you earlier, even though overwhelmingly elderly people in nursing homes are vaccinated, although the vaccine helps with bringing down the rate of COVID infection, it doesn't eliminate that possibility, nor actually does it bring the likelihood of severe infection with COVID down to the level that it is for unvaccinated younger folks. So, elderly people are not sufficiently protected if just they are vaccinated, and they're congregating in a crowded space with other people, and they're unvaccinated nursing home staff around them. It's not going to work. There have been some outbreaks in nursing homes. Not particularly common for there to be a widespread outbreak, but it has happened because some of the workers were unvaccinated. And so vaccinated as well as unvaccinated elderly people caught COVID. Most of the vaccinated people did okay. Didn't have to go to the hospital or anything, but some did. Okay, well, it's going to be piecemeal rather than national. I don't think we're going to have a national mandate for everybody to be vaccinated, and you're not going to have thugs showing up to your door and forcing you to be vaccinated. That's not going to happen. But even though it'll be in a piecemeal fashion, vaccine mandates are going to become more prevalent, whether you like it or not, particularly as vaccines become fully authorized by the FDA. Actually, the Pfizer vaccine is expected to receive full authorization as opposed to the emergency use authorization that it was under since December, sometime next week. Moderna will probably be, in a month or two, something like that, a couple of months, and then maybe others will follow. Okay, well, as I said, I'm curious what you think, but let's see what the American public in general thinks. Mass. Okay, so if you recall, 64% supported mass mandates. For vaccine mandates, 57% support vaccine mandates. 37% opposed. 6% are not sure. And again, patterned by political affiliation, replicates what it was for mass mandates. Democrats supported by a margin of 78% to 16% opposed. Independents, pretty evenly divided there. 48% support, 42% opposed, 10% unsure. Republicans mostly opposed, 35% support, 59% opposed. By race, again, not surprisingly, fewer white people support vaccine mandates than people of other ethnicities. With the highest, not surprisingly, given cultural factors, Asians, 82% support vaccine mandates and only 17% are opposed. Well, let's consider some of the arguments from people who are opposed. Not to pick on anybody here, but one person who's been very prominent on Twitter in opposing vaccine mandates and opposing vaccines generally, actually, at least for COVID, has been Fiorella Isabel from Convo Couch. She says vaccine mandates create a two-tiered society directly targeting the already disempowered working class, including a large number of minorities. Not to mention the obvious overreach from an already corrupt and roided out government. Not surprised Natalie doesn't get it, though. So Natalie Shure, columnist for the New Republic, says she supports vaccine mandates in certain circumstances. She says she supports them for requiring proof of vaccination to fly, and says she feels that's justified because it'll encourage a significant number of people to be vaccinated and is least likely to hurt the poor because poorer people are less able to afford to fly anyway. That's her argument. Now, they didn't have the polls on vaccine mandates broken down by social class, but again, they did have them broken down by ethnicity, and black and Hispanic individuals who were polled were somewhat more likely to support vaccine mandates. Pretty significant majority there um, than white poll respondents. So, you know, evidently a lot of people of color aren't buying this argument. But let's go on. So you go, and again, these are just sort of representative arguments from people who I've seen expressing opposition to mandates or to the COVID vaccines generally. So she says, reminder that the U.S. is doing everything they can to force a non-FDA approved experimental vaccine. Not sure why it didn't switch over. Okay, did that time. Okay, I'm really not sure why it won't switch to the other window. That's really odd. Okay. Okay, well, let me read it again in case you forgot. Reminder that the U.S. is doing everything they can to force a non-FDA approved experimental vaccine on Americans while pharmaceutical companies rake in millions but won't lift a finger to give people health care or economic stability, which would help health to begin with. And then she says of people who are supportive of vaccine mandates, which remember is the majority of the American people at this point in time, particularly people of color, and particularly, but Democrats, and on the other hand, Republicans are the biggest group opposed to it. So in agreement with Fiorella in being opposed to vaccine mandates. But anyway, she says these people. Let me just read what this person she's quoting said. We're never getting out of COVID without vaccine mandates. I'm sorry if this hurts your feelings, but we are reaching a point where we're not moving the needle. We need vaccine mandates to get out of this disaster. Somebody named Jacqueline, Chaotic Socialist, says. So Fiorella says, these people are headed toward fascistic ideology. They give the left a bad name. They also fail to look at even mainstream media and the CDC, who had to admit this vaccine does not stop the spread. This is endemic and will be with us. Demanding mandates for an experimental vaccine is insane. Okay. Well, again, it's important to bear in mind, most of the people who are hardcore against the vaccine are Republicans or Trump supporters and so forth, who are overwhelmingly white. Now, it is true that people of color are less likely than white people to be vaccinated overall. At least non-Asians are less likely, black and Hispanic and Native American and so forth. Although I haven't looked at the figures, but I think American Indians have a pretty high vaccination rate relative to some other groups of people of color. But anyway, African Americans have a lower vaccination rate than white Americans, and it's not necessarily because that demographic is particularly likely to buy into hardcore anti-vaccination ideology, but it's more things like, well, they're suspicious for various reasons, but they're not convinced one way or another, or they're more likely to face, which anybody can, but certain groups of people of color especially are more likely on average to face barriers such as work schedules, and in general, because they can't find child care for their kids so they can make time to go get vaccinated, or they can't get away from work or whatever. That's an access barrier that exists currently in the United States, and we need to make vaccines accessible for everyone. We need to require that employers give people time off to get vaccinated without any penalty, if they choose to get vaccinated. We need to make sure that people know where they can get vaccinated, that they're not living in a vaccine desert, so to speak, and there's a place they can get vaccinated nearby, and so forth and so on. Certainly, if we can't make vaccines accessible to everyone and give everyone the same information that they need to make an informed decision, then yes, mandates would be discriminatory. But we need to make sure that they are accessible to everyone and that everyone has good information about the vaccines. Now, one of the things that she said, which I have seen other people say, I don't think I have that called up anymore, but she said something about like the same ruling class that is imperialist and killing millions of people overseas. He wants to give us vaccines, and why would you trust that they really care about saving your life or your health? Well, that's not very relevant because imperialist countries have been giving people vaccines for more than a century. You can both have a rapacious capitalist class, brutally imperialist and brutal to the working class at home, that still takes effective public health measures. Mandating masks during a pandemic, or just in general, mandating vaccines, or taking measures to socially distance people during periods of high infection. Lots of countries with lots of different political characteristics have taken these sorts of measures. As I mentioned earlier, most countries have had some sort of vaccine mandates for a long, long time. But okay, putting those things aside, basically there are two major claims here that I've heard from many people. One claim is that we can't trust the entities deemed to be involved in creating a safe vaccine to do so. And the other claim is that it's authoritarian or even fascistic to impose a vaccine mandate. So let me just take both of those up in turn. Okay, so as far as the case for trusting the vaccine, or vaccines, because there's more than one, right? There's 3 authorized for use in the United States, about 20 in use around the world. But anyway, since I'm from the United States, I'm addressing issues here in the United States. Okay, so what about that claim that the vaccine is experimental and hasn't been thoroughly tested, and correlated with that, the claim that it might have long-term side effects? Um, okay, well, as for the claim that it's experimental, which, uh, just so you know, the claim that it's experimental is, a very common anti-vax talking point. You know, and this is from a article on the website Science-Based Medicine. I'll put it in the links. I highly recommend that you read it. The Anti-Vaxxer Playbook to Destroy Confidence in COVID-19 Vaccines. So, what I want to try and get across to you here is that there's this group of folks in the background who are not merely skeptical about or opposed to the COVID vaccine, but in general, are opposed to any vaccines. Have been for a long time. In many cases a vested financial interest in pushing the anti-vax narrative. People like Andrew Wakefield, who started the claim about supposedly vaccines causing autism, because as it turns out, he was making that claim against a particular vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella that he was developing a vaccine to compete with, so he had a financial interest there, and he made up fake data. Was eventually caught for it, but he convinced a lot of people that vaccines caused autism. And people like Joseph Mercola, who's worth about $100 million, sells all sorts of alternative healthcare products and alternatives to vaccines, as well as books and videos and so forth. He has a best-selling book on Amazon right now. And one of the claims that these folks are pushing is COVID-19 vaccines are dangerous. They were rushed. They are killing people. Natural immunity is better. Which is, even though, yes, there is natural immunity, it doesn't seem to be better than immunity from vaccines. And people who are previously infected but unvaccinated are more than twice as likely to get COVID again than people who were previously infected but are fully vaccinated. Vaccines are experimental. Big Pharma, Bill Gates, blah blah blah. COVID is an exaggerated threat. It's just the flu. 99.9% survival rate. That sort of stuff. That's where this is coming from. And unfortunately, a lot of people wind up believing these sorts of things, because they're repeated over and over again. Because the anti-vax movement, so to speak, has a really high-profile presence in social media. So these claims have kind of permeated the discourse. And one thing we psychologists have discovered in our research is that things that are repeated over and over are more likely to be regarded as true, independent of what the evidence says. And so that's come to be the case with these claims about vaccines. But clinical trials for vaccines started well over a year ago, back in May, I think, for Pfizer, and late March for Moderna. I forget when for Johnson & Johnson, but a long time ago. they completed the clinical trials, found that they both were very efficacious in reducing the likelihood of getting infected with COVID, although that was the original variant back then, and you know did not find major safety issues. Severe side effects have been extremely rare, and since then, the vaccinations have been administered to billions of people. Again, occasionally you do rarely find severe side effects, but they are very rare, like on the order of 1 in 1 million or 1 in a few 100,000 or something like that. And you know, uh, compared to other vaccines, you have a very comparable, if not better, safety record. Certainly, we haven't seen anything turn up where, like where with polio vaccines that used a live but attenuated polio virus, some people could actually get polio from taking it. We don't have any indication that anything like that has happened. As for the claim about we don't know if there are long-term side effects because it's only been a year or whatever since the vaccine started being tested out. We do have plenty of reason to believe that that's not the case. Just from a scientific perspective, most of the vaccines that are in use, including the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, are based on existing technologies that have been used for vaccines before. The two that are mainly used in the United States, and there are the most commonly used vaccines for COVID in the world right now, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines use mRNA technology, messenger RNA. So basically, what those vaccines do is that you have injected into you instructions, through which is what messenger RNA is, to cells to produce a spike protein similar to that that you find on the coronavirus. And so then, after that spike protein is produced, the immune system springs into action, recognizes that as a potential pathogen, and fights it. And so that way, your immune system will be better prepared to recognize and fight the actual coronavirus if it comes into your body. And the mRNA dissipates from your body pretty quickly. Let me just show you a quick video clip from someone who certainly knows far more about this than I do. Because, basically, although I'm a scientist, I'm a social scientist, I'm a social psychologist, so anything that I tell you about, epidemiology or virology or vaccines or whatever, I rely on people who have expertise in that area for my information. I'm not just spouting this off the top of my head. So anyway, here's a virologist from Duke University talking about this idea that there might be long-term side effects of the COVID vaccine. Let me make sure I've got the video set up. Nope, I don't. Okay.
Yeah, so the vaccines that we know of don't have long-term side effects. One of the things that's quite clear is when the FDA asked for data, they asked for 2-month average side effect profiles for both of these vaccines, although the companies continue to track people out for at least a couple of years. So within the 2-month window, there were no adverse safety signals that we saw. when we think about what is biologically plausible to be a side effect that's longer than that, really it's well beyond the point when any of those long-term safety issues ever take place. So really the only long-term question that we don't know is durability, and that's how long does it last? So there's no reason to think that an mRNA vaccine that's eliminated from your body actually very quickly as part of natural processing of such a product would cause a late-term problem that didn't already show up at the 2-month mark. So I think one of the things that people need to be clear about is that there's a big difference between understanding how long it lasts, which we may not know, and having any reason to fear that there's late side effects. There's a big difference in that. And we don't have reasons to think that there's late side effects. Okay, and there was the ones that were seen short in the short period of time we understand really well.
Okay, so there doesn't appear to be any biologically plausible reason, he says, for there to be any long-term side effects that would not be apparent in the short term, i.e. within a couple of months after you're getting the vaccine. There just isn't really any way that anybody knows of as far as how that would work. And we haven't seen this happen with vaccines in the past. If they have side effects, they show up in the short term. Okay. And another point about this is, look, people talk all the time about big pharma, blah blah blah, big government. You can't trust them, etc. Well, we live in a capitalist society, so every product that you buy or that you use, whether it's driving a car or flying in an airplane or whatnot, is made by some sort of profit-seeking enterprise. At least in our country, there's some countries with more mixed sorts of economies where it's a little bit of both, corporations and government and cooperatives and so on and so forth. But in any case, it's of course it's possible for manufacturers of products to screw up and make something unsafe. So when I was a kid, Ford made a car called the Pinto that had problems with an exploding gas tank in cases of crashes because of where the gas tank was placed. So it was an unsafe product. But, in general, there's safety regulations for cars, and they've gotten safer over time, and the vast majority of them are safe. Same with airplanes. You find cases where a manufacturer cut corners and there was a safety issue. So, for example, there was a safety issue with the autopilot on some Boeing 737s not very long ago, a couple of years ago. It caused a couple of planes to crash. So a few hundred people were killed. And it caused a number of other planes to have near crashes. But overall, flying on an airplane is safer than driving your car, or safer than anything else where you're traveling at high speed, pretty much. It's probably safer than riding a bike if you're riding it in an area where there's traffic. And most planes are safe. And they do catch issues eventually as they come up. These days I drive a Toyota Prius. It gets great mileage, it's comfortable, it's roomy, has a decent amount of amenities, good stereo, etc. And it's super reliable and it's very, very safe. Making that car made Toyota a ton of money. It's to companies' advantage to make good products. Similarly, making vaccines that worked better, were more effective, as well as being safe in clinical trials. Uh, Making good vaccines pays off for the companies who make them. In contrast, competitors whose vaccines weren't good enough to get authorized didn't, and there were several. There were a lot of attempts to make vaccines that failed. Merck, for example, a big pharmaceutical company that was the original producer of ivermectin, which seems to be popular among anti-vaxxers as a treatment for COVID. Merck tried to make a vaccine for COVID. They failed. It didn't work. It wasn't effective at producing an immune response. So they didn't make any money off of their attempted vaccine. On the other hand, Pfizer and Moderna have made a ton of money. Other vaccine manufacturers undoubtedly will or have as well. Because they made a product that worked. It's not like executives of these companies are a bunch of Dr. Evils sitting around dreaming up how to do people harm just for the hell of it. And neither are the scientists who either work for them or in many cases work for universities. And the other thing is that particularly in the middle of a pandemic, but I guess the same logic applies for cars. You don't want to manufacture a car that you wouldn't want to, that you wouldn't feel safe driving in yourself. But similarly, we've got a pandemic on our hands. Millions of people have died. Many more than that have suffered severe illness or suffering long-term severe illness. And every single person in this world, whether they're a billionaire or a poor person, whether they're Bill Gates or the executive of Pfizer or somebody who works at McDonald's, has a vested interest in there being a safe and effective vaccine. So because there's self-interest in two ways: one, money, and secondly, their own protection from a potentially deadly virus. The people who make vaccines are going to want to make good vaccines. And all the research so far suggests that they have done so. Okay, well, then let's look at that research just briefly, and I'll quickly make the case for that, which I know I've done in prior episodes, but I just want to briefly do that today. Okay. All right, so I already showed you the data from Israel, right? Where for every age group, shoot, not it. For every age group, the rate of severe cases of COVID was much, much lower for people who were fully vaccinated than for people who were not vaccinated. Although, again, you still have a higher likelihood, even if you're fully vaccinated, of getting severely ill from COVID if you're an elderly person, particularly people over 70, than if you're a young person. Again, on average, not for everybody. Even if you're fully vaxxed versus an unvaccinated young person, although young people can still get long COVID. Here's some data on from various studies on vaccine efficacy against the Delta variant, this highly contagious variant that we have you know, amongst us now. Um, for preventing symptomatic illness, so in other words, you notice that you're sick. Um, in the UK, they found an 88% efficacy rate. In Canada, 87%, and in a study in Israel, 64%. So, in other words, somewhere between 2/3 and 5/6, about 88%, 64 to 88% reduction in likelihood of being infected with a case of COVID that causes you to have symptoms. I don't have it called up right now, but just the other day in a previous episode, I showed you a study out of Imperial College in London where and much higher rates at preventing hospitalization with the Delta variant in these studies, which are of I believe they're of Pfizer. In all of these studies, although some of the vaccinations might be AstraZeneca in the UK and Canada. But anyway, I talked with you the other day about a study out of Imperial College London that showed that there was roughly 75% efficacy against getting symptomatically ill with COVID for the Delta variant. And among those who did get infected, there was roughly a 50% reduced likelihood of transmitting the disease to others, and lower viral load. And this was a study where they just randomly sampled people. They didn't know if they had COVID or not. They just randomly sampled people and gave them a test. And then, if they tested positive, you diagnose them, and the test gives you an the index that they use, the viral load, the CT cycle threshold value, and so they found that on average, people who tested positive who were vaccinated had a lower CT level, a higher CT level, meaning lower viral load than people who were unvaccinated. Here's some data from various countries. Let's see. Can you see all that? Yeah. Okay. Comparing efficacy of vaccines in preventing infection, and the study also looked at hospitalization, but I don't see those data here. For both the alpha variant, the one that originated in the UK, and the Delta variant, which originated in India and is the one that's more than twice as contagious as original COVID and roughly 60% more contagious than alpha. For Pfizer, BioNTech, about 95% efficacy in an English study in preventing symptomatic infection with COVID. Against the Delta variant, it's still 90%. With AstraZeneca, like 67% against the Alpha variant, 60% with the Delta variant. Scotland, similar results. Higher for Alpha than Delta, but still about 80% for Delta with Pfizer, about 60% against Delta with AstraZeneca. Israel, more than 95% efficacy in preventing symptomatic infection against Alpha. In other words, roughly 1/20th the likelihood of getting infected with the Alpha variant of COVID, if you were vaccinated with Pfizer versus unvaccinated. For the Delta variant, it was, I believe, 64% was the figure. And in Canada, with the Pfizer vaccine, about 90% efficacy against the Alpha variant, and I think that's about 87% against the Delta variant. And there have been other studies. For example, a study out of Minnesota recently that showed, in July when the Delta variant became prevalent in Minnesota, that the efficacy of the Moderna vaccine dropped to about 76%, versus originally being about 90 to 95%. And for Pfizer, there was a drop from mid 80s in their initial data from earlier in the year to only 42% efficacy in the month of July. And a lot of people who are opposed to the vaccine have cited that one data point as a reason to argue against people getting vaccinated. But I mean, even if that's true, even if it's actually true that the Pfizer vaccine is only 42% effective against COVID, and those other studies figures, against Delta, and those other studies figures that are much higher than that are not accurate for Pfizer. And even if it's not just because people in the study got the vaccine a long time ago and its efficacy has declined, let's say that 42% is really how effective Pfizer is against the Delta variant. It's still 42%, right? It's not 0%. And so you're 42% less likely to get COVID if you're vaccinated. So therefore, more than 42% less likely to transmit it to somebody else, because on average you're going to have less severe symptoms. So therefore, on average, over the course of having the illness, which is going to be shorter on average if you are vaccinated, you're going to have less potential to infect other people than somebody who's not vaccinated. Again, most of our estimates of the effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine in preventing infection, symptomatic infection with Delta COVID are higher than that. But even if it's 42%, each and every person who gets vaccinated is reducing their likelihood of transmitting it to somebody else than would be the case if they weren't vaccinated. So let's just hypothetically say everybody got vaccinated, with a 42% effective vaccine. That would be enough if it was 100% vaccination rate, given the cascading impact of COVID is less able to infect person X, Y, or Z who are all vaccinated. That's going to be enough to knock out the virus. Now, granted, we're not going to probably get to 100%, but I'm just saying, even cutting the likelihood of infection and transmission roughly in half is a whole lot better than 0. Okay. But, as far as we know at this point, efficacy is still pretty good, although there's increasing evidence that it does decline somewhat over time. So, with that in mind, the CDC has announced that people will be eligible for booster shots in the fall, as we do, much as we do with other vaccines. For polio, you get 3 or 4 shots instead of just 2. So, standard practice to get booster shots. Okay, so in conclusion, let me just make a philosophical case about mandating vaccines. And I do want to stress that I'm not saying this is the only measure we should take. As I already mentioned, I think we should mandate public indoor mask wearing for everybody, regardless of whether they're vaccinated or not. I think we should probably, at least while we have this current surge of infections, We should probably go back to things like closing indoor dining for a while and compensating, restaurants for or bars for lost income. And we probably shouldn't have in-person school, especially given that kids under 12 can't get vaccinated. We can afford to hold off on that for a little while, you know, until we get the level of COVID infections down. And then, later this fall or early winter, everybody will be eligible to be vaccinated and will be in a lot better shape. Um, but, my perspective on this is as not only a social scientist who's studied um, you know, uh, cultural and ideological impacts on behavior in response to this pandemic, finding that, for example, more politically conservative as well as more individualistic culturally governments as well as individuals are less likely to do the things that need to be done to control COVID, less likely to have mask mandates, or if they do, they delay them until lots of cases have spread, less likely to lock down or don't have lockdowns for long enough to knock the case rate down enough, and so on and so forth, so that ultimately what you find is that, for example, collectivist countries like China or Vietnam or Taiwan or many others, most of the countries in the world, on average, have had much lower rates of COVID, at least until this point where we had inequality in vaccination combined with a much more infectious variant. That's changed that somewhat, but, for the most part, collectivist cultures, as well as states in the United States or provinces in Canada, we have found in our research, have lower rates of infections and deaths from COVID, collectivist and more liberal folks and governments do. And also that governmental policies and individual conduct is more conducive to controlling COVID in more, collectivist or group-oriented sorts of societies, like China, let's say. So in the United States, we live in a very, very individualistic society. And so we have a lot of people, even on the left, who place an extreme emphasis on individual liberty to, for individuals to behave however they wish. To a certain extent, only minimally considering the behavior's impact on others. It depends on the issue. I don't think most of us would argue in favor of it being legal for somebody to drive drunk, but who knows. But that libertarian with a capital L / individualistic streak seems to be very strong here in the United States, even among people on the left. Folks who support vaccine mandates have been accused of being fascist or Nazis or various other name-calling. You're a dupe of big pharma or corporate media and so forth and so on, even if you do what I do, which is read scientific journal articles. And somehow this notion that you should be free to do whatever you want, go anywhere you want, even a hospital or a nursing home during a pandemic without being vaccinated or perhaps without even being masked, has come to be considered an important aspect of quote-unquote freedom. Largely among MAGA people, but even among many in the segment of the left that sounds frankly a lot like libertarians at times. And as a socialist, I reject this extreme individualism. And nonetheless, I'm someone who strongly believes in grassroots democracy, one of the 4 pillars of the Green Party. I strongly oppose censorship. I favor legalization of all drugs, but I'm not on board with this idea that we can't impose any restrictions on what individuals can do for the greater good. I think we need to be more focused on how our actions potentially impact the well-being of others, and stop thinking of it as being some sort of God-given right to freely go about our business, unvaccinated and perhaps unmasked, maskless, in a sea of strangers who we might potentially infect with a virus that could make them seriously ill, or give them long COVID, or kill them. I don't think we used to think this way to such an extent that seems to be the case today. Because we've had vaccine mandates for public school attendance and for travel to foreign countries for over 100 years. And that's been true in countries throughout the world. And hardly anybody, except what used to be a very small contingent of anti-vaxxers, ever accused countries of being fascist before because they had vaccine mandates. But all of a sudden now it's fascist to require people to do something to protect their neighbors? Now maybe you think that it's different now because there's now discussion of mandates for public spaces like restaurants and hospitals and nursing homes and public transit. But is it really different? Again, we've had mandates for vaccines in order to attend school our whole lives. What's different now is that we're in the middle of a pandemic. Most of us aren't in school, so just mandating vaccines in schools, especially given that right now kids under 12 still can't get vaccinated, they're not eligible for a vaccine yet. School mandates isn't going to cut it in getting our vaccination level up to where it needs to be to help us bring COVID down. So at least for now, we've got to extend mandates to spaces where we haven't had them in the past. Spaces like restaurants and gyms and nursing homes and hospitals and mass transit, airlines and so forth. Once we're past the pandemic, and once the vast majority of people are vaccinated for COVID anyway and get boosters as they're needed, we can probably drop those kinds of mandates. So, I don't think that once we're out of the pandemic, it will continue to be the case that you'll have to, for example, show your proof of vaccination when you go to eat indoors at a restaurant. But right now, I think we need them. Especially given, as I've talked about, being vaccinated is no guarantee, especially for elderly people. It's, by no means that rare, especially for elderly people, and especially given the contagiousness of the Delta variant, for vaccinated people to get infected if they're in a space where there's poor air circulation, there's one or more infected people there, they're close to them for an extended period of time, they can't wear a mask, etc. Because again, the way vaccines work is not by building this force field around your body that keeps viruses out. Viruses, if they're there in the atmosphere, COVID is mainly through aerosol transmission, little particles of water vapor containing the virus floating around in the air. So if you're in a space where there's a lot of that, a lot of the virus will come into your body. And odds are that your immune system will be able to fight it off. But, there's, depending on the study you look at, anywhere from a 50 to 90% lower chance of you getting infected if you're vaccinated, but that's not 100%. And you're more likely to get severely ill if you have a breakthrough infection and you're elderly, even if you're vaccinated. So, again, once we're past the pandemic and once the vast majority of people are vaccinated for COVID anyway, we can probably drop those kinds of mandates and maybe go back to requiring kids in school to be vaccinated for one more thing, for COVID. And again, I don't think that mandates for masks or for vaccines are probably going to be enough by themselves. But, a sizable minority of the American public has been resistant to every single measure that's been implemented to control the pandemic. They protest against mask mandates. They disrupt school board meetings and even physically attack people, like rip off their masks and stuff. They're against lockdowns, even though they have been proven to be extremely effective at controlling COVID outbreaks in places like New Zealand and China, which you don't have to implement them very often because they do them so well. They do contact tracing and testing, and don't let people just come willy-nilly in and out of the country without making sure they don't have COVID, and so forth. They take it very seriously. It works. I should mention that regarding the collectivism, individualism dimension, there are exceptions to the rule, like New Zealand, which is a Western country. It's officially considered, according to research, to be an individualistic society. But it's done splendidly, as I discussed in the last episode, and they're not even that highly vaccinated, about 20% fully vaccinated. So they've relied almost exclusively on mask mandates, lockdowns, very rarely, border controls, and extensive contact tracing and testing, and it's worked. So we need to think about stricter measures to bring our caseloads down, as I talked about, with such a contagious variant, and right now we're only at 51% vaccination. Because the more we wait to implement those sorts of measures and just let COVID continue to infect people willy-nilly, especially if they're not vaccinated, the more time there's going to be for a new variant to evolve that's going to be more vaccine resistant, the more people are going to die. We're up to almost 1,000 deaths a day now from 250 earlier in the summer. There's all this unnecessary death and suffering ahead of us if we don't take this pandemic more seriously than we have and mandate that people do the things they need to do to get it under control. Because I would really like to know what people who are opposed to vaccine mandates, let alone anti-vaxxers, let alone people who are opposed to mask mandates or crying out loud. What do you think is an alternative for getting the pandemic under control? How likely is it, do you think, we can emulate a place like New Zealand? What do you propose we do? Just let the virus rip through us and cause mass death and suffering until eventually the virus kind of burns itself out. It's infected everybody there is to infect. Is that really what we want? The impact of the pandemic on the U.S. has been horrible in every way. And if you don't think of it that way, and you don't feel strongly, as I do, that we as a society need to take major steps beyond what we've been taking to end it, I don't see how you can call yourself a progressive or compassionate person. All right, let me know what you think. Please like and share and subscribe. I will see you next time.